Wren Hollowell was 20 years old and had been told her presence was no longer required in the only house she had ever known. It is a peculiar, hollow feeling to be standing on a granite ridge in Gunnison County, Colorado, looking at the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Rockies you have memorized since childhood, only to realize that no part of the earth beneath your boots belongs to you anymore. She stood there with exactly $1 tucked into the watch pocket of her denim pants and a small glass vacuum tube, a tool for catching voices out of the thin mountain air, resting in her rucksack like a heavy secret. She spent that solitary dollar on an abandoned, stone-walled radio station standing at the end of a long dead access road, a structure that had been forgotten by the FCC and the townspeople alike. But what nobody in the valley knew, and what the people who cast her out could never have guessed, was that inside the massive, floor-to-ceiling iron transmitter cabinet in the center of that silent room was a mechanical secret that shouldn't exist, something that would change her life, and the broadcast heritage of the mountains forever. Before we continue, if stories like this, stories of the things we find when we have nothing left, mean something to you, hit subscribe. It helps us keep these Legacy Road stories alive. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the miles. Wren's story didn't start with the eviction notice or the cold biting wind on the ridge. It didn't start with the harsh words of a step-aunt who saw her only as an extra mouth to feed after her grandmother passed. It started in the rhythmic, ozone-scented, amber-lit atmosphere of her grandmother's workshop. Her grandmother, Odessa Hollowell, was the last true master of the clear air. Odessa didn't just broadcast weather reports, she performed what she called the balancing of the frequency. She believed, with a fierce, quiet conviction, that a community was only as healthy as the invisible waves that connected it, and that the act of tuning a crystal set was the highest form of maintaining the peace of the valley. The Hollowell lineage was tied to the copper and glass of the Colorado mountains by the wires they strung and the heavy ceramic insulators they used to catch the history of the world in a steady hum. The lineage stretched back through 7 generations of calloused hands and steady hearts, beginning with an ancestor named Silas Hollowell who had crossed the mountains in the early 1800s with nothing but a set of German-made telegraph sounders and a recipe for ever-still contact grease that required no chemical and a perfect ear for the static of the ionosphere. He understood the physics of the wave, how to marry a human thought to a lightning bolt using nothing but the placement of a copper coil and the strength of a rhythmic pulse. No shortcuts were allowed in a Hollowell station. No modern digital transmitters were permitted to cheat the surface of the sound. It was a trade of absolute integrity. Odessa had been Silas's great-great-granddaughter, and she had practiced that trade for 65 years, her ears eventually becoming as sharp as the granite ridges she used as natural reflectors. When Wren was 5 years old, the real lessons began. Odessa didn't believe in toys, and she certainly didn't believe in distraction. She believed in the knowing of the spark. She would sit Wren down on a low, 3-legged stool near the transmitter rack, a place where the air was always thick with the sweet metallic scent of hot solder and the sharp, clean smell of mountain pine. Odessa would hand her a handful of tiny, discarded copper filaments, heavy for their size and perfectly coiled, and tell her to close her eyes. She told her that the eyes were a signaler's second tool, but the skin was the first. She taught her that the air was a living ocean, and that every solar flare or distant thunderstorm was a wave in a sea that stretched from the ground to the stars. She explained that when the sun hits the atmosphere at noon, it creates a specific frequency, a vibration that a Hollowell could feel in the marrow of her bones. This wasn't magic. It was the accumulation of 2 centuries of listening. Odessa would place a heavy glass insulator on the table and have Wren rest her palm on it, over and over, until she could hear the difference between a day with clean air and a day with magnetic drift, just by the shiver of the glass. "The world wants you to look with your eyes first, Wren," Odessa would say, her voice sounding like the very resonance of an AM carrier wave. But the eyes are easily fooled by a shiny microphone or a bright studio light. The eyes want to see the listener before the signal has even left the peak. You have to look with your skin. You have to feel the draw of the air. If the static is vibrating too fast, the mountain is anxious and the voice will break. If the air is heavy and dead, the signal is lazy and the message will struggle to reach the ranches. You find the hum, and you find the strength of the community. You find the peace in the pitch. A station that doesn't hold the voice is a house that is lost in the fog, child. Never forget that the sky remembers the words that were thrown against it. By age 6, Wren's primary job was the sorting of the crystals. It was a task that required the kind of patience most adults have forgotten in the age of instant gratification. She would spend hours at her grandmother's feet, separating the pure quartz crystals from the cloudy seconds and the fractures, the vibrational dead spots, from the prime frequency stock used for the master oscillator. Wren learned that every single piece of stone had a memory. She learned that the clear quartz held the history of the high-altitude winters, making it fast enough for a clear signal, while the smoky quartz held the memory of the deep earth, making it strong enough to anchor the base frequencies. She learned that to disrespect the stone was to disrespect the shepherd who would eventually trust their life to the weather report. By age 8, Wren was finally allowed to assist with the tuning. This was the most physically demanding and spiritually significant part of the signal master's work. They used a set of hand-forged brass variable capacitors, 2 heavy frames that fit together perfectly to ensure the station required exactly the right amount of electrical pressure to find the carrier. Wren would stand on a wooden box, her job being to use a small bone folder to adjust the plates while Odessa listened to the beat frequency. The rhythm had to be exact. Too much adjustment and the signal would overshoot the valley, too little, and the room would never answer. The plates would hum as they moved, a deep, rhythmic vibration that Wren could feel in her elbows and her chest. "The resonance is the truth, child," Odessa whispered during those long, focused sessions. "If your mind is wandering, the hum will be muddled. If your heart is angry, you'll strike the frequency too hard. You have to be as steady as the granite under these peaks. We don't make sounds that are temporary. We make ones that are enduring. Every adjustment of the dial is a promise that the song is still there. We are building the sanctuary of sound before the listener even knows he's standing in it." A tuner who doesn't respect the decay is a person who has already lost the melody. At age 10, the curriculum shifted to the art of the silent wave. This was the most delicate part of the trade, involving the use of shortwave radio to bounce signals off the ionosphere. A Hollowell broadcast was designed to reach around the curve of the Earth by skipping off the sky. Wren would watch as Odessa used a hand-wound coil to find the skip in the atmosphere. Odessa taught her how to read the drift, the subtle shift in the Earth's magnetic field that would change the pitch of the reception. She taught her that the world was not a silent thing, but a constant conversation of energy. "The drift is the doubt," Odessa would say. "If you ignore it, the voice will be a ghost of the truth. You have to account for the sun's own memory of being a fire until the copper can breathe. The radio station is a mirror for the soul. If you aren't honest with your signals, your life won't be either. You must know the shape of the silence before you can know the shape of the broadcast." By age 12, Wren was sent out into the old mining camps alone. Her task was to search for the specific materials the trade required. Lightning struck copper, which were wires that had been hit by mountain lightning, losing their resistance and gaining a conductivity that made them sound like bells when energized. She learned to identify the wires by the way the oxidation spiraled over them in the high alpine meadows. She learned how to use a wire scribe with such precision that she could mark a live wire without hurting the metal's internal crystal structure. She learned that a station's beauty wasn't in its call letters but in the honesty of its ground wire. By age 14, she was entrusted with the frequency check. This was the difficult art of determining the drift of a transmitter using only her own pulse and a crystal oscillator. If the station was off by even 3 cycles, it would interfere with the emergency bands. Wren learned to move with a stillness that matched the air's own molecules. She learned that any hesitation in the hand was a danger to the safety of the valley. She learned that the kilohertz wasn't just a measurement. It was a marriage of separate moments into a single, safe reality. Odessa used to tell her stories during the long, humid afternoons while they sat on the porch, their fingers moving in a blur of polishing the brass terminals with lemon and salt. She told her about the Great Silence of 1944. The war had taken the vacuum tubes and the fine copper, and the local stations had all gone dark, leaving the mountain towns isolated in a world of static. People stopped believing in the voice that year, Odessa said, her hands never stopping their work on a capacitor. But they didn't stop needing the signal. They brought me their cracked speakers and their dead batteries, desperate for something that would tell them the world was still capable of connection on the other side of the ridge. I spent a whole winter doing nothing but re-beating, taking the broken past and turning it into a resonant future. We kept the heartbeat of the county alive that year, Wren. We showed the silence that we could still find the flow. Every signal I trued was a way of saying, we are still here. We may be muted, but we are not stopped. We were the only ones who knew how to find the frequency when the world went white. Then there was the story of the Hollowell station. Odessa told her about a massive fieldstone building her own grandfather Silas had built in 1895. It was meant to be the master signal hub for every signaler in the Rockies. But the FM bands had arrived, and the AM station had been abandoned to the ivy and the mountain goats. Silas had been a man of deep secrets and deeper math. Silas put a secret in that transmitter, Odessa would say, her eyes twinkling like the orange glow of a power tube. He said that a frequency is a lock, and the right resonance is the key. He told me the station would wait for a Hollowell who knew the value of a silent hum. He spent 3 years building the transmitter cabinet alone, and he never let anyone see the mechanism beneath the master dial. He said the signal is a private conversation. The teenage years were spent in deep, exhausting apprenticeship. Every Saturday morning from the age of 15 to 18 was dedicated to a specific type of antenna alignment. 1 month it was dipole mounting, the difficult art of angling a copper wire so it could throw sound over the continental divide. Another month it was impedance matching, which required a perfect synchronization of resistance to avoid a muddled signal. Wren learned the chemistry of the trade, how to balance the distilled water and lead acid in a station battery to ensure the power stayed constant but hard enough to travel 100 miles. Odessa was a hard teacher. If a connection wasn't soldered with perfect clarity to within 1/10 of a millimeter, she would take a pair of snips and cut the wire from the terminal, letting the copper fall to the floor. If you send a lie out into the world, it will eventually find its way back to you, Odessa would say. A station that broadcasts the wrong frequency is a lie told to the person who has to trust it with their life. Start again. Feel the hum. Be honest with the air. The relationship was one of quiet, shared labor. They would work for 6 or 7 hours without speaking, the only sound being the rhythmic click, click, click of the relays and the hiss of the cooling fans. Wren grew to love that silence. It wasn't empty, it was full of the work. She learned that a person could say more with a well-timed pause between pulses than they ever could with 1,000 words. She learned that her grandmother's love wasn't expressed in hugs, but in the sharpening of a terminal post and the demand for perfection. Odessa passed away on a crisp, silent morning in late October, just as the frost was beginning to turn the larch needles to gold. Wren found her in the attic workshop, her hand resting on a brass master key for a line extension, her fingers still holding the tension of the last broadcast. She was 85 years old. She had outlived her husband, her siblings, and her own daughter, Wren's mother. Odessa had been the sun around which Wren's entire world orbited. With her gone, the gravity of the mountains felt different. It felt like it was trying to push her off the land. Within a month of the funeral, the cast-out moment arrived. Wren had been living in a small cabin on her step-aunt's land, but the aunt decided that the property was worth more as a mountain bike rental shop for tourists. She informed Wren that she had 48 hours to pack her bags. Martha looked at the heavy brass telegraph keys and the bins of glass vacuum tubes with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You're 20, Wren," the aunt had said, her voice flat and practical. "You can't spend your life playing with string and magnets in a shed. The world is satellite broadcasting and internet streaming now. There's no money in tradition. I'm giving you 2 days to clear out. The probate is finished, and the property is mine. You should go find a real job in the city. Maybe you can work at a call center." Wren left with her canvas rucksack, her glass vacuum tube, her grandmother's favorite silver soldering iron, and $1 she had found tucked into the back of Odessa's favorite ledger, the Silas Hollowell station blueprints from 1895. She had nowhere to go, no car, and no plan. She spent 3 nights sleeping in a bus station in Gunnison, her fingers tracing the edge of her vacuum tube by the light of a flickering neon sign. The cold seep of the mountain air was a constant reminder of her new reality. She felt like a pulse that had been sent out and then left to decay into static, waiting for the echo to find her again. She felt like the world was a vast frequency band, and she was the only station without power. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making legacy road stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt like a silent history was calling you home, even when everything else was falling apart? Wren was sitting in the corner of a small diner near the town square, trying to make a cup of black coffee last for 3 hours, when she overheard a conversation between 2 men in the booth behind her. They were talking about an old stone building that had been abandoned on a piece of federal surplus land near the river. "That Hollowell station," one man said, shaking his head. "Been sitting there since the FM towers came in the 60s. The county finally put it on the surplus list because it's a tax liability. $1 flat just to sign the deed and take the responsibility of the antenna. Nobody wants it. It's more moss than brick, and the tower is a liability. It's a death trap of rusted steel and heavy stone." Wren's heart didn't just beat. It surged. She knew the Hollowell station. It was the one Odessa had told her about, the one Silas had built. She walked the 8 miles to the county building in the fading afternoon light. The clerk was a man named Mr. Gable, who looked as old and weathered as the basalt cliffs themselves. $1, kid," Gable said, looking at her scuffed boots and the French braids. "You pay the cash, you get the iron key, and you have the deed. But I'm telling you that place is a graveyard of echoes. Nothing in there but rust and regret. You'll be the one responsible if a gale knocks that antenna onto the access road." Wren handed over her final $1. Her hand didn't shake. She felt a strange, anchored certainty. Gable handed her a heavy iron key and a stamped paper. The station was tucked into a deep mountain pass, overgrown with briars and shadowed by a dying walnut tree. It looked like a fieldstone fortress that had been petrified by time. She put the key in the heavy oak front door. It groaned, but it turned. She stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of old ozone, damp stone, and something else, something that smelled like Odessa's workshop. The building was a cathedral of iron and light. Massive pine timbers rose up into the shadows of the rafters. But it was empty. The sound booth glass was shattered and the benches were rotted. As Wren began to clear the debris from the central broadcast floor, moving with the rhythmic focus Odessa had taught her, she noticed something strange about the massive transmitter cabinet. It was a block of heavy cast iron and brass, 6 feet tall, set into the floorboards in the center of the room. Resting on the transmitter's control panel was a single, massive rotary dial. It was missing its primary labels, but it was built of the finest ever-still brass Wren had ever seen. Wren remembered the riddle Odessa had told her, that a frequency is a lock. She pulled her grandmother's blueprints from her rucksack and looked at the diagram of the cabinet. There, hidden in the scrollwork of the master dial's center, was a tiny inscription. The air must sing the home code's ghost, or the station remains a grave. Wren realized that the cabinet wasn't locked with metal. It was locked with a specific series of harmonic frequencies. The broadcast floor was designed to carry a vibration directly into the internal counterweighted locks of the transmitter. She took her glass vacuum tube from her bag. She didn't have a power source, but she remembered Malachi's blueprints showed a series of earth batteries, copper and zinc plates buried in the wet mountain soil beneath the station foundation. She spent the next 4 hours locating the terminal wires under the floorboards, cleaning the corroded ends with her silver soldering iron. She connected her tube to the circuit. She could feel the faint, ancient tingle of the Earth's own current through the glass. She sat on the floorboards next to the transmitter. She took a deep breath. She manually turned the master dial, finding the Hollowell frequency, a specific low-frequency AM band that Odessa had taught her to find in the winter skip. It was exactly 1,210 kilohertz. The hum was pure and haunting, the sound vibrating through the very stones of the station. Suddenly, a deep sub-bass click echoed from inside the transmitter cabinet. A magnetic latch, powered by the natural weight of the earth battery, released. The 2 primary locking bars inside the floorboards slid apart with a heavy, rhythmic thrum. A section of the broadcast floor, 4 feet square, began to sink slowly into the earth, acting as a counterweight. As it descended, a secondary pedestal, made of lead and cedar, rose up from the earth behind the transmitter to take its place. Wren stepped forward as the pedestal reached the floor. Inside the floor vault was a sanctuary Silas Hollowell had built to protect the soul of the trade. On a central shelf sat a heavy iron lockbox and a set of 12 lead-sealed silver vacuum tubes, each one a masterpiece of electrical engineering, hand-carved with the Hollowell star. These were Silas's finest tools, designed to pull a signal out of the air even in a solar storm. But beside them was the real treasure, a collection of sealed glass jars containing the eternal signal oil, a specialized lubricant for precision relays that had been lost since the 1920s, made of whale oil and crushed sapphire. Wren opened the iron box first. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk, were stacks of gold coins, Liberty Head double eagles, dated between 1870 and 1910. She counted them slowly. There were 46 coins. At today's market value, it was over $23,000. But it was the object at the very bottom of the vault that made her breath catch. It was a map of the Rocky Mountain signal grid, a mechanical device made of brass and copper that tracked the electrical resistance and atmospheric health of every peak in the state. It was the Hollowell Heart, the original blueprint for keeping the wilderness connected. Tucked inside the map case was a folded letter written in a bold, elegant script. "To the Hollowell who remembers the hum," the letter read. "My name is Thomas Hollowell. I am the son who stayed to guard the station. I kept these tools and this gold safe because I knew the world would one day try to sell our connection for a profit. But a Hollowell knows that a voice is not a commodity. It is a weight. These silver tubes are the weight of our family's honor. The map is the voice of the mountain. I have kept them safe in this stone heart, waiting for the one who knows how to listen to a spark. The gold is for the station. The tools are for the trade. The map is for the future. Don't let the Hollowell hum die. Find the note. Signed, Thomas Hollowell, 1928. Wren did not cry. She didn't let a single tear fall. Instead, she took her vacuum tube and ran it along the edge of the first silver-mounted sounder. She felt the pulse of the history against her thumb, a rhythmic, metallic potential that had been waiting for her for a century. A deep, rhythmic sigh of arrival escaped her lips. She took a small scrap of copper wire from her rucksack, the last piece of her grandmother's favorite antenna, and clutched it to her chest, the metal smelling of the workshop and the mountain. "I'm here, Uncle Thomas," she whispered into the silence of the station. "The hum won't stop. I promise you that." The next morning, Wren walked back into the town of Crested Butte. She didn't look like a girl who had been sleeping in a bus station. She went to the bank first, her hands still smelling of the ozone and the ancient lead. The teller's eyes went wide as Wren laid out the gold coins, but the deed to the station and the letter provided the legal bridge she needed. After securing her deposit, she went to a small used car lot on the edge of town. She bought a 1992 Midnight Blue Dodge Dakota. It was a tough, square-body truck with a long bed and a manual transmission. It was a beater, with one primer gray fender, but the engine hummed with the same dependable rhythm as a well-calibrated sounder. She paid $1,900 cash. It was the first thing she had ever owned that didn't belong to a grandmother's mercy or an aunt's whim. She felt a surge of pride as she shifted the gears, the Dakota rumbling to life with a steady mechanical sound. The restoration began immediately. Wren moved her meager belongings into the base of the station office. The first month was spent entirely on the antenna breath. She spent every daylight hour on the roof and the tower, stripping 90 years of rust from the steel and replacing the rotted ceramic insulators with the new, hand-fired porcelain. She learned the specific voice of the station, how the stones expanded with the heat and how the iron tower resonated with the movement of the storms outside. She wasn't alone for long. Word of the Hollowell girl and the working station spread through the hollows like the chime of a bell. A man named Silas, named after her ancestor, who ran the local hardware store and had been a friend of Odessa's in the old days, stopped by the station one afternoon in his truck. He brought a crate of fresh apples and a gallon of high-grade copper cleaning solution. "Thomas was a ghost for a long time, Wren," Silas said, leaning against the station door and looking at the new timbers with a nod of approval. "He thought he could bury the connection, but a Hollowell is tied to the hum. I reckon he saw the trade in you even when you were just a toddler at Odessa's feet. You're doing good work, child. This valley has been missing its heartbeat for a long time." Silas became a mentor and a recurring visitor. He helped Wren source the specialized vacuum seals she needed to repair the transmitter and showed her where the original copper plates were buried in the mudflats. Every Tuesday, Silas would stop by with a small gift: a jar of honey, a new set of precision pliers, or just the local news. His presence made the station feel like part of the world again, a thread tied back into the community. The homemaking was a slow, deliberate process of reclaiming her life. Wren built a heavy earmaster's bench from reclaimed oak inside the office, mirroring the one she had worked at in Odessa's study. She installed a small cast-iron stove for warmth and for heating her battery chemicals. She scrubbed the stone walls with vinegar and salt, removing the smell of neglect until the scent of the cedar and the ozone could breathe again. The first night Wren spent in the office after the station was fully restored was the first night she truly slept in years. She listened to the slow, heavy thrum-thrum of the wind against the antenna, the sound vibrating through the very stones of her bed. She was no longer a pulse cast aside, she was the signaler herself. She felt the weight of the gold in the bank, and she felt the weight of the responsibility in her hands. She placed Odessa's photograph on a small shelf she had carved from a piece of red cedar. She hung the silver vacuum tubes in a secure case above her bench, and she kept Thomas's letter tucked into the frame of the window so she could see his words every time the sun rose over the river. She was no longer at the mercy of others. She was the architect of her own course. The restoration of the Hollowell heart maps was more than just physical labor. It was a sensory immersion into the heart of the Hollowell heritage. Wren spent hours each day in a specific rhythm. In the mornings, she would prepare the cleaning solutions, the smell of the ammonia and lemon filling the office. Then she would spend the afternoon at the bench, the microscopic strokes of the silver pen turning under her watchful eye as she updated the signal grid. She also began to experiment with her own ever-still oil, just as Silas had done. She gathered specialized resin from the ridge to use in her refinement, and she spent nights studying the mechanical charts, her mind exploring the possibilities of architectural physics. Her station became a gallery of silver and copper, the finished sound panels gleaming on the shelves like captured light. In her second year, the business began to take shape. She got a commission from a high-end mountain rescue service in Aspen that had heard about the signaler of the station. They commissioned her to restore a collection of 19th-century emergency transmitters. She spent months on that order, her hands moving with a precision that surprised even her. She realized that the pull she felt in her hands was the same pull Silas had written about, the strength to hold the connection when the world wanted to accelerate. Community reputation began to spread by word of mouth. Neighbors would stop by with their old shortwave radios and their confused electronics, asking if she could find the hum again. They would stay for a cup of coffee and a story, their voices filling the office with a warmth it hadn't known in 40 years. She charged a fair price for her work, not enough to be rich, but enough to live with dignity. It was a trade that commanded respect, and she was the one who held the key. One Saturday, an old rancher named Mr. Byler brought in a small hand radio that had been used by Odessa in 1950. The antenna was snapped, but the Hollowell star on the base was still as clear as a bell. "Can you save it, Wren?" he asked, his eyes searching Wren's. Wren spent 3 weeks carefully resoldering the frame and replacing the crystal, feeling Odessa's original tension beneath her own fingers. It was a conversation across time, a handshake with a ghost. Mr. Byler became a regular visitor, bringing elk jerky and news from the high pastures. The station became a hub for the valley. People would come not just for signals, but for the sense of continuity that Wren had restored. She began to host small workshops on the weekends, teaching the local children the basics of the trade of the click. She wanted them to understand that their heritage wasn't just a digital track, it was something they could hold in their hands and feel in their bones. She remembered a specific afternoon in the 3rd year. A young girl, no older than 7, was trying to sort the grains of the earth battery. Her small hands were struggling with the zinc plates. Wren sat down beside her and told her the story of the Great Silence of 1944. She saw the girl's eyes light up with the realization that she was part of something bigger than herself. In that moment, Wren knew that Odessa's legacy was safe. The hum would continue. The seasons in the Rocky Mountains have a way of anchoring a person to the earth. The winters are harsh and silent, the peaks frozen in place. Wren spent those months in the office, the wood stove her only source of warmth and light. She would sit by the fire and draft new signal designs in the old Hollowell book, her mind constantly exploring the possibilities of the mountain energy. The summers are humid and vibrant, the air thick with the sound of cicadas and the smell of wild mint. She would gather her stones in the river, the tall trees providing a canopy for her work. She also became a guardian of the valley's history. She worked with Silas to catalog the town's mechanical collections, ensuring that the stories of the mountain families were preserved for future generations. She understood that her trade depended on the health of the memory, and she took that responsibility as seriously as a signaler takes the balance of the air. On a clear, copper-lit evening in late October of her 4th year, Wren sat on the stone threshold of her station. The midnight blue Dodge Dakota was parked in the clearing, loaded with finished transmitters for the Aspen Hall. The smoke from her small stove rose straight into the still air, a signal of life and work in the deep hollow. She looked out at the horizon where she had stood 4 years ago, homeless and alone. The wind was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat, it felt like a rhythm to be followed. The meditation on the trade had become her daily practice, her way of staying centered in a world that often moved too fast. She realized that the trade of the click wasn't just a physical requirement for fixing a signal. It was a philosophy for living a meaningful life. To find the hum was to understand the natural texture of reality. To hold the tension was to remain steady in the face of change. To keep the connection was to ensure a future that had a pulse. She realized that Odessa hadn't just been teaching her how to polish brass and connect wires. She had been teaching her a way of being in the world. She had been teaching her that a radio station is not a static object, but a living partnership between the tuner and the mountains. That's the thing about the signals our grandmothers teach us to find. We do not always know when we are 6 years old and sorting contacts on a workshop floor that the sorting is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, pulse by pulse, wave by wave. We learn that the sanctuary is only as good as the spirit of the one who trued it. We learn that the beauty of a thing is in its function and the honesty of its construction. And then, years after the old woman dies, we tune a dial in a ruined station we bought for $1, and we understand what she had been teaching us all along. She had been teaching us that a signal does not just store data. It sets the intention for the grace. It tells the world that someone lived here, someone broadcast these things, and someone cared enough to keep them bright and steady against the darkness. It is an act of defiance against the silence of the world. She had been teaching us that the heartbeat isn't just in the body, it's in the wire. It's the will to keep the truth whole, to keep the doubt at bay, to make a promise with your hands that doesn't break for winter or mountain. Wren Hollowell was 20 years old and homeless on a granite ridge. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned radio station in Gunnison County. She discovered that she wasn't just buying a ruin, she was reclaiming her soul and securing her place in the long line of signal keepers. She was the signaler now, and as long as she held the key and felt the hum, the Hollowell name would never be taken by the silence. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a moment of peace today. Every story we tell is a tribute to the trades that built us and the heritage we carry forward in our legacy road stories. We make these for the people who truly listen, the ones who understand that the old ways still have a place in a fast world. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. See you on the next Legacy Road Tale.